Chapter 7, Protein, Screencast 3. Now, this screencast will be focusing on two primary topics. One is going to be sources of protein, and we're probably going to be comparing how Americans typically get their protein compared to other countries. And we're also going to be talking about how protein is actually assessed for quality. So those are the major things we will be talking about in this particular screencast. Now, when we look at the sources, we need to remember that they are coming from our diet, but also that they're going to be recycled as they are released during the breakdown as our body's proteins are broken down. And the thing we keep in mind here is dietary proteins are needed to replenish and maintain that amino acid pool that we talked about earlier that is necessary to maintain protein synthesis and repair. Now, when we look at the typical North American diet, this is probably one of the biggest issues. We are over-consumers of protein, and the real issue here, though, is that where we get our primary source of protein. 70% of our protein comes from meat, poultry, fish, milk, cheese, legumes, and nuts. When we look at a typical diet worldwide, typically 35% of protein comes from animal sources. A good example would be the Mediterranean diet, where the majority of proteins that are found in that diet are plant-based overall. Now, when we look at the benefit of plants in addition to protein, they also are going to be providing fiber, vitamins, phytochemicals, minerals, and such. But there are some really important dietary benefits that are associated with plant proteins. One, primarily, they do not contain cholesterol. Remember, cholesterol is limited to animal-based products. Plant proteins have very little, if any, saturated fat. And there is also evidence that plant-based proteins will help decrease the risk of cardiovascular disease, certain types of cancer, diabetes, and obesity. So one of the trends that we should try to strive in our overall diet is to increase the amount of protein that we are getting from plant-based sources. And think about when you go grocery shopping and all of the varieties that are currently available of plant-based proteins. Imagine going to a restaurant and what protein do you want? So it's not just meat, chicken. So we have so many more choices than we ever had before. And there has been continual improvement in the quality of plant-based proteins, especially in the past 5 years or so. Now here, one of the things that I really like about our textbook are these various examples that they have of diets and diet plans. So here we're basically looking at a menu. We have two options here, one for 1,600 kcals, another for 2,000 kcals, and really kind of give us an idea of things that are actually rather desirable overall. If we look at breakfast, that is something that many of us would probably consume. If we look at lunch, grilled chicken breast, salad greens, a baked taco shell strip. So all of those, and that's one thing, like I said, I really do like that they make diet plans and menus that are actually palatable and something that people would actually eat. And that's really the important part, okay, that you are looking at something that people will actually consume. Now, we kind of talked about this previously as far as different types of food sources that are out there for proteins. And as we can see here, one thing that I want to point out is if we look at some of them in particular, and one of the biggest sources of protein when we look at the RDA, and it's actually tofu. So 1 cup of tofu almost on its own approaches, okay, almost 75%, if not more than 75% of the RDA of protein for women. So keep in mind that there are some very, very good plant-based sources of protein out there. And remember, tofu is one that's considered to be a complete protein. Now, the next couple of slides are focusing on how they actually evaluate food protein quality. Now, please keep in mind, you're not going to be responsible for doing any of these calculations, but I think it is important that you're kind of aware about these measures because what they're doing, they are really indicating a food protein's ability to support growth and maintenance. And when we look at the things that kind of come into play, or what's going to have an impact here, the digestibility. And the digestibility of proteins is much higher when we look at animal proteins. And the other thing that we have to kind of take a look at is going to be amino acid composition. So here we're going to be looking at BV. That is actually nitrogen retained in grams divided by nitrogen absorbed. Now keep in mind, remember, what really makes proteins different from any other of the energy yielding molecules or biological molecules, period, is the presence of nitrogen. We have the PER, that's going to be weight gain divided by protein consumed, and then there's a chemical store, and this is the milligrams of limiting amino acids per gram of protein divided by milligrams of limiting amino acid per gram of an ideal protein. And so if we have some other scores, which basically are made up of both the chemical score and digestibility. Now, the first measure that we want to kind of take a look at is biological value. This is probably one of the easiest ones to kind of think about. So this is a measure of how efficiently the absorbed food protein is converted into protein within our bodies. If all 9 essential amino acids are present, we efficiently incorporate amino acids into the proteins within our body. And so this is going to be determined by comparing the nitrogen retention in the body with that found in the food. And a standard quite often is going to be egg white, and that protein has a biological value of 100. One thing to keep in mind, if we are to compare animal-based proteins to plant-based proteins, animal proteins will always have a much or significantly higher biological value than those found in plant proteins. They tend to be significantly lower. When we look at protein efficiency ratio, or PER, as we noted, this compares the amount of weight gain of laboratory animals consuming a particular protein that's being studied against the weight gain of a lab animal consuming some reference protein. And this is a reflection of a food's biological value. And this is what the FDA actually uses to set standards for labeling foods, especially those that are designated primarily for infants. Then we have the chemical score. Now, this is actually calculated by taking the amount of each essential amino acid in a gram of food protein being tested and divided by the ideal amount for the amino acids in grams of a reference protein. The lowest amino acid ratio calculated for the essential amino acids of test protein is the chemical score. And this actually ranges from 0 to 1.0. Now, if we look at what the most widely used method is, this is protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. This is calculated by multiplying a food's chemical score by its digestibility. If a protein is missing any one of the 9 essential amino acids, this score is a 0. And this is actually what's used to determine the percent daily value on nutrition facts panels for all of the food labels that we consume. And one thing to notice, not often are you seeing a protein listed on a food panel. And the reason why is, as Americans, we typically have no problem getting enough protein. Now, one thing that I do want to put an emphasis on, and this is something that you should be able to provide examples of, is the concept of balance. And when we talk about nutrition, balance in particular is a really important topic. We have imbalance, negative balance, positive balance. We'll actually be revisiting this when we actually start talking about energy balance in chapter 10. And so this is the method that's used to actually determine protein needs. If you have someone that's healthy and not in a period of growth or recovery, need to consume protein in an amount that replaces proteins that's lost in urine, feces, sweat, etc. If protein intake equals the loss of protein, then we're looking at imbalance or a state of equilibrium. So you should be able to give examples of these 3 conditions. If protein intake is less than losses, individual is in negative protein or nitrogen balance. This is something that will develop when eating inadequate amounts of protein, and that can also be coupled with other conditions such as some type of serious untreated illness or injury, or looking at diseases that specifically increase the breakdown of protein. If protein intake is greater than losses, individuals are said to be in a positive protein or nitrogen balance, and this occurs primarily during growth, but also recovery from trauma, some type of an injury, illness. Think about the increased protein needs there for someone to recover from these various conditions. Now, here, once again, are some examples, and one thing that our textbook uses pretty regularly are scales and balances. And so here, I'm going to start in the middle where we actually see nitrogen equilibrium or nitrogen balance. And as noted, this is the situation that exists when nitrogen equilibrium occurs. So a healthy adult is meeting protein and energy needs. A positive nitrogen balance, this is a situation when we have more protein, and examples are going to be growth, pregnancy, recovery stage after illness or injury. But think about an athlete doing resistance training and they're exhibiting an increase in lean body mass. If we look at some time periods where there is an increased secretion of different hormones, for example, insulin, growth hormone, and testosterone, those would be something that we see in a positive nitrogen balance. Here, when we talk about a negative nitrogen balance, we're looking at an individual that is not getting the amount of protein that's necessary. This could be due to not getting enough energy, period. So think of someone that is anorexic. That's a really good example. We have some trauma conditions such as fevers, burns, and infections. So you get the idea overall, okay? And so make sure that you're kind of comfortable with the examples that are on this slide, because one of the short or opportunities for short answer questions will be nitrogen balance.